sail, but my life.
It's the stuff legends are made of. A hugely talented teenager from Christchurch joins the first Kiwi pop band to go to the United Kingdom, rises to rock and roll fame and fortune, and then crashes and burns before he turns 30. Bass players in rock bands mostly blend in as part of the rhythm section. They help keep things anchored and rarely take centre stage. But the bass playing and stage presence of Gary Thane broke the mould.
He was totally fingerstyle, and it gave that, really funky, solid, driving beat. And he had calluses on his hands that carpenters would have been proud of.
His style of playing, more suited to a lead guitarist, had audiences mesmerised. After his time with Kiwi band Me and the Others touring Europe, his melodic riffs undergirded Britain's Keith Hartley band, before he was recruited to join progressive rockers Uriah Heep for their classic years from 1972 to 1974.
Gary came in, and he's just like playing these lead lines all over the place, but they fitted the song so well. It really was the first one I've heard like that, and it was quite inspirational, really. Dee was up there with the front men. We all, I think that was one of the qualities of Uriah Heep, was that the fact that we were all kind of like five front men, and to a degree. I'd put him right up there at the top, the top three bass players of the world, I've got to say.
I'm Keith Newman, and this is the first of a two-part story recounting the musical adventures of legendary rock bassist Gary Thane, a Kiwi rock and roll casualty. You'll hear from former Kiwi bandmates, guitarist Dave Chapman, singer-guitarist and keyboard player Paul Muggleston from Los Angeles, and Uriah Heep founding member and guitarist Mick Box in London, the only member of the original band still on the road today. Gary Thane paid his dues, playing in top Christchurch bands in the early 1960s before heading to England in 1966 with Dave, Paul and drummer Peter Dawkins as Me and the Others, the first Kiwi pop band to head into the heart of the Brit rock scene.
You find a love you can share, one you can call your own. Just close your eyes, you'll be there.
Friends from his school years at the Catholic Xavier College in Christchurch describe Gary as quiet, a little broody, and with an obvious passion for music. His first success was winning a school talent quest with his brother Conrad singing the Pete Seeger song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Gary began playing bass at the age of 13, later joining his brother Arthur on vocals and lead guitar in The Strangers, with Graham Ching on rhythm guitar and Dave Beattie on drums, who was later replaced by Peter Dawkins. The band played the popular chart hits of the time and built up a strong following, with Gary often referred to as the swinging bass player. The Strangers released 3 singles, including a Gary Thane composition, I'll Never Be Blue, recorded in 1965 when he was 16 years old. Paul Muggleston takes up the story.
He grew up with his brother Arthur, and Arthur was a very good guitarist. And the Strangers, in fact, were a very good band. They used to play at a place called the Caledonian Hall. And that was kind of the schoolboy days. And then when he left Xavier, I think he became a linesman, or was an apprentice linesman.
During the same period, another Christchurch band, The Secrets, were resident at top club The Plainsman. When the strong vocal band with Wayne Allen on drums and Derek Wright and Paul Muggleston on guitars lost their bass player, Muggleston says there really was only one person they wanted to fill those musical shoes.
We offered him the job, and we were the only professional band of its kind. In other words, working 5 nights a week at the Plainsman. Quite frankly, we really wanted Gary. Of all the bass players around, we knew that if we had him, we would probably be the best band around.
So what was it about Gary that stood out?
he had an incredible feel for making that bass drive. Not carrying the group by any means, but certainly driving it along. It was just his style of playing. And of course, the equipment he had was pretty good too, for considering the days. And it really was a powerful group, that band, The Secrets. The music was right. We were doing Beatles stuff. We were doing Jerry and the Pacemakers and everything that was popular in its day.
Well, baby, tell me alone. Well, I cry when I'm on my own. Well, you'll find out when I'm gone. Oh, you're right.
The Secrets hooked up with promoter Ken Cooper in Wellington, and for the rest of the North Island, Phil Warren took the reins, getting them work in top Auckland nightclubs, including the Beetle Inn. They proved a popular draw card, supported Gene Pitney and the Searchers on their New Zealand tour, and soon found themselves in the recording studio.
When you gonna come back and mend my heart? When you gonna come back and throw it apart? Well, if you...
We had a song that I wrote, and the flip side, Gary and I wrote. A side was called It's You, and the other side was You're Wrong. It was written about an ex-girlfriend of mine.
Gary got to write about your ex-girlfriend?
Indeed he did. But he came up with the idea of the harmony build-up. And yeah, it was just fun working together, and we were nominated for the Loxine Golden Disc for It's You, which was nice. I think it was Ray Columbus got it that year with Till We Kissed.
Dave Chapman was playing lead guitar with a group called The Others, founded by former Strangers drummer Peter Dawkins. They won the audition for the Miss South Canterbury show, working with Tommy Adderley and Lou and Simon, and took to the road as support act for the Tom Jones and Herman's Hermits 1965 tour. They became resident band at Christchurch night spot, The Pride of Place. It was there, alongside fellow resident band The Secrets, that Chapman first got to know Gary Thane.
Like every band, I suppose, when we started off, it was fairly ho-hum, but Peter was a good leader. He had good ideas. He was very, very strict on a lot of things, and I suppose in those days we really looked up to him for that. We did get good. The audition for the Pride of Place, there was a second group who left, and The Secrets replaced them, so that's when I really got to know Gary well. The Secrets disbanded, and two members from that band, which was Paul Muggleston and Gary, teamed up with myself and Peter Dawkins from The Others. We renamed ourselves Me and The Others.
I got some kind of feeling, gonna party up with you, baby, that's nice. Got some kind of feeling that you feel the same way too.
Rather than jump the ditch to Australia to progress their musical career, as many did in those days, the ambitious Me and the Others imagined they might drop a touch of Kiwi on the UK scene at the height of the Britpop explosion.
It was prompted as much as anything by my dad, passed away the year before, and my mother said, well, I'm going back to England. And I said, well, maybe the lads would like to go to England. Derek Wright, our lead guitarist, didn't want to go, and Dave did, and Dawkins did, and certainly Gary and I, who were very close in those days, we thought it'd be a great idea. So we told his mum, and his mum's last words to me were, "You look after Gary," and I regretted her saying that ever since, of course.
Paul Muggleston and Gary Thane departed for England on the Australis, a month ahead of their drummer and lead guitarist. They saw the pyramids in Egypt, stopped over in Sri Lanka, and were soon soaking themselves in the sounds of '66 and looking for temporary work while they waited for their bandmates.
Gary and I got a job driving a milk cart. We were both on the same milk cart, and that lasted half a day, and I really feel bad because We left this milk cart in the middle of the road, never got our money, never got paid for it. Then decided that we'd go to New Zealand House, and there was an ad for Cowboys wanted up at Cowboys City in Kirby Misperton. So Gary said, why not? And neither of us had ridden a horse in our lives before. We drove up in my Triumph Herald that I bought. We both got a job, but then they found out Gary really couldn't ride, and my attempts at riding were pretty pathetic, but they agreed to teach me, at which stage Gary said, look, I'm going to head over to Scarborough.
Don't you ever feel bad. Think of me, I'm the man. When the day comes and you're down, I have no problem. Go around, hold on.
Gary Thane scored regular work with a Scarborough covers band called Just Giggin' Around. In May 1966, when Muggleston turned up at the overseas terminal to welcome Chapman and Dawkins, their bass player was nowhere to be found. Muggleston crammed their suitcases into his Triumph Herald, strapped the drum kit onto the roof rack and took them to the bunkhouse at Cowboy City until he could complete his contract at the theme park. The boys then rented a house in Clapham Common in London. They were seriously wondering whether they might have to find a new bass player, and were greatly relieved when 2 weeks later Gary Thane reappeared. Me and the others were together again and ready to begin rehearsing new material for their shot at the big time.
We thought we were going to take the New Zealand, the surfing sound, the Ray Columbus sound. We had all these local ideas that we were going to throw on England. We suddenly found out that the whole scene was soul and fuzz guitars and goodness knows what else. It was a totally different picture to what we'd gone thinking we were going to do. Dave bought the fuzz box and had to adapt very, very quickly, but he still had his early influence, if you like, from New Zealand with him. And I think probably the combination of the two of them made him a different guitarist to the model that had been invented in England. He suddenly invented his own sound, but this became a way of playing brass instruments on a guitar, as well as some pretty wild screaming things. I don't know any better way of describing it.
One night, Peter and I were walking through Soho. We came across this Greek restaurant. What stopped Peter in his tracks was the fact that there was a newspaper cutting sellotaped on the window of this Greek restaurant, and it had "What's Viv up to?" Now, Peter was a very big Viv Prince fan, because Viv was the drummer of the Pretty Things, and he was a very, very good drummer. So he stopped and he says, hang on a minute. I said, oh, come on, hurry up. And he said, no, hang on, he said, I want to read this. So he read this newspaper cutting, and it said on it, since Viv Prince has left the Pretty Things, he's now hosting a club in Soho, London, called Knuckles. And Knuckles just happened to be down the stairs from where we were standing. We went down the stairs, and Viv just happened to be talking to the doorman. Peter put his hand out to shake hands with Viv, who looked at him very, very blank, and he said, look, my name's Peter Dawkins, I'm from New Zealand. We've just done a tour with Tommy Adley, and he sends his best regards. Well, Viv's face just lit up, and hey, fellas, come in. He gave us a meal. We had drinks. I remember the Easy Beats had just landed in Britain, and they were there, so we shared a table with them. We were there for about an hour. So Viv said to us, do you want a job? And we said, sure, we're looking for work. So as a consequence from that, we did a 2-week stint, and then very shortly after we came back for another 2-week stint. We had a lot of musicians that used to come down there. Pete Townsend from The Who was down there one night. I remember him sitting there listening to us, and Mick Jagger was also down there one night too. I suppose a watering hole, so to speak, for musicians. Viv asked us, he said that there was a new guy on the block that was looking for a backing band for a tour, and his name was Engelbert Humperdinck. And Peter said, I cut doubt, he says, yeah, we're our own band. He said, anybody with a name like that, no, go away. All the time we were in England. We lived in Chelsea. We had 2 bed sits there. It was a good part of England. It was just off the King's Road, and that's where it was all happening in those days. Peter and Gary were one side of the road, and Paul and I were the other. Gary and Peter were living next to Viv Prince.
Dawkins was a very accomplished drummer, and he also sang, of course. I, being the rhythm guitarist, realised there was a great void in the group very, very quickly when we were in London. I sadly traded my 1962 or 3 Fender Stratocaster for a Vox Soundcaster, which to all intents and purposes looked like a Stratocaster. And I also, in the trade, got a Vox Continental organ, which of course was the rage of the day. And people like Alan Price were playing with the Animals, which gave us a totally different sound again. And it worked. Everywhere we went, people really liked the band, there's no question.
Gary bought a big sound. He played a Gibson 335 bass, and he had a Vox amplifier with 2 15-inch speakers, one either side of the stage. I used a Vox AC 50 amp, Paul used a big Epiphone amp, and Peter was playing Rogers drums. So we did have very, very good gear.
You're sitting here thinking, got my hands on my knees. Think what the world needs is more trash.
Gary was a guy, he was full of life. He had a great sense of humour. He was just full on, and he was an extremely talented musician, even from a young age. Gary was a very, very good bass player. He used to slap the bass rather than use a pick, and he was a showman. People used to look at him and just watch his style. He was a finger-picking bass man, and sometimes when we're doing, say, a fast number, his actual hand looked like it was going round on his wrist, like on a swivel. And there wasn't many people that played like that in those days. We met a guy by the name of Jack Fallon, Kana Variety Agency. He'd had quite a bit to do with the Beatles. In fact, he was a musician himself, and he'd played instruments on 1 or 2 of the Beatles' records. Jack auditioned us at the Whiskey A Go-Go in London. His words were, "I'm knocked out with the band." Well, he signed us up, and he got his work all over England, all the way from Cornwall to the top of Scotland. We were on the road very, very regular, and I do recall in those days there were lots of groups, in fact hundreds if not thousands, that were starving, just no work. We were very, very fortunate.
At the Blue Lagoon Club in Newquay, Cornwall, they were supported by Reaction, featuring drummer Roger Taylor, later of Queen. And they shared the stage with the Graham Bond organisation, whose rhythm section of Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker would shortly team up with Eric Clapton in Cream. Me and the Others were truly Kiwi pioneers, arriving 4 months before the 4/4s, which morphed into Human Instinct, and well established on the scene before Instinct got their first gig.
As far as we're aware, we would be the first band to have left New Zealand shores to go to England. The only other band that was there at the time was the Maori Volcanics. I thought they would have been a totally different repertoire to us.
It didn't take 5 minutes for me to get rid of the Triumph Herald and buy a Bedford van, which became obviously the band van. And with that, we had the independence, so we were able to, places like the Beach Ballroom in Aberdeen was fantastic. Sitting in the band room, having a chat, and we'd seen the hall in rehearsal. And we hadn't actually looked at the crowd before we went on stage, so we got up, and we're all set up to do it. And then this booming voice comes out, here they are, direct from New Zealand, me and the others, blah, blah, blah. And the curtains went back, and it was just a sea of faces, and the sea of faces sort of surged towards the stage. And it was one of the wildest scenes I've seen in my life, and it was so thrilling. It really was. It was great.
Their booking agency wanted Me and the Others to take a more aggressive approach to an Ivy League song, Love Is Not a Game, which they recorded in November 1966 at Regent Sound in London.
We adapted it to give it quite a very fuzz-blown, compressed, heavy sort of a sound, which is far different to anything that had ever come out of Britain.
Me and the Others had won an audition to go to Germany and planned to complete a B-side to their single and possibly an album on their return. In late 1966, they followed the Kinks into a month-long residency at Germany's top club, the Piant Hit House in Schwabing, Munich. Rhythm guitarist, keyboard player and singer Paul Muggleston says the band worked hard, packing in the crowds day and night, but the hours were ridiculous.
The Piant Hit House was just the top club in Munich in Germany, and to have played there at all was real feather in the cap. But we did the month, and it was absolutely fantastic. We'd work 3 in the afternoon to 3 in the morning, and we were working 7 days a week. You got 3 minutes off in the hour sort of thing.
How was Gary responding to that kind of pressure? I mean, I understand that he was working all the time to get his sound, to improve it. He was listening to a lot of other artists, but what was the personal toll of this on his life, do you think?
Gary used to enjoy being happy, and happy pills were very available. I do not think at any stage that his playing was degraded by whatever he might have been taking. Gary definitely worked at trying to get a better sound, trying to drive things more. Unlike many bass players in those days, never used a plectrum. He was totally fingerstyle, and it gave that, really funky, solid driving beat. And he had calluses on his hands that carpenters would have been proud of. He was just a hard worker and studied what he was doing, always trying to be, I guess, better than what he was.
A change of venue presented a challenge for the band who had been used to the adoration of the younger set. Now they were confronted with a more serious audience who had other things on their mind than falling under the spell of a visiting pop band.
We got through Munich because a lot was the fact that we had fan adoration, or whatever you'd call it in those days, and the same people would return time and time again. We went on from Munich into Stuttgart, and we did the Armed Forces bases there. But again, we were working, pretty much 7 nights a week. Though they liked the band, it was a totally different atmosphere. Essentially, you've got guys who are heading off to Vietnam who are trying to get off with the girl they just met, and they're interested in dancing and getting drunk, and that wasn't the audience we'd been used to.
There was general concern for Thain, who'd been losing weight since they first arrived in England, as Dave Chapman explains.
His main focus was his music, his cigarettes, and perhaps a bit of a puff, and he wasn't a good eater, and that was of some concern to me. Whenever we go for meals somewhere, Gary'd have soup. He was really thinning out. So we got to this Air Force base where we were doing the gig, and we arrived in the afternoon. We set up our gear and they let us into the officers' mess. We were sitting up at the bar, and Gary said, "Well, can I have a brandy and lime?" We all had one, and I gotta say it was rather tasty. But Gary drank his fill. When we came to play, Gary was nowhere to be found. It must have been an hour had gone past. The people that were in there waiting for us to play were really getting brassed off. The airmen actually, a couple of them grabbed our guitars and switched on the microphone, and they were strumming away and singing themselves. Anyway, we finally found Gary, and he was in a flower garden. And so we pulled him up, tipped a bucket of water over his face, and says, "Hey, Gary, come on home, mate. We've got to get there and play." So we wound up going up there and completing the evening, but as a consequence, I don't think we got paid for that night.
Paul Muggleston and Dave Chapman, tired of the hours and the endless succession of gigs, decided to call it quits. However, drummer Peter Dawkins and bass player Gary Thane were determined to push on.
It was winter time in Germany. It was also very, very cold. Gary and Peter decided no, they wanted to stay in Germany playing, so we just had a unanimous decision, well, hey, we'll call it quits. So Gary and Peter went back to Munich, and they teamed up with a guy, Ed Carter, and Ed Carter later became a lead guitarist for the Beach Boys. So they called themselves New Nadir. Now, they went back to the PN Club. They played there. They played in France, and they played Switzerland and all over the place.
This is a thing I've never known before. It's called easy living. This is a place I've never seen before, and I've been forgiven.
In part 2, Gary Thane and Peter Dawkins go their separate ways. Dawkins to become a legendary record producer, and Gary Thane, the waif-like bassist from Christchurch, a session player with the cream of Britain's musicians before joining John Mayall's former drummer Keith Hartley for 5 albums, and then superstardom as part of the 5-piece heavy rock unit Uriah Heep. Musical chairs next week, Gary Thane, a Kiwi rock and roll casualty, part 2.
Easy living.